Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to tonight's lecture. Tonight we have a special guest speaker with us, Nathan Eldridge, based out of Portland, Maine, and he is a portrait photographer who has an uncanny ability to capture his subjects visually. His clientele revolves around advertising agencies, major publishing companies, magazines, and corporations. But regardless of if he's photographing a celebrity such as Richard Russo or an organic farmer, Eldridge uses the same creative and critical eye to make a successful photograph. His images have appeared at Photo Place Gallery in a show titled Figures Context, which was a group show curated by Cig Harvey. And in 2012, he published a book titled Portraits of the Public, featuring portraits taken of those he's met on the street between the years of 2003 and 2011. The Good Idea Grant, which was awarded to Eldridge in 2011 by the Maine Arts Commission, funded this book. Eldridge's work has been featured in several publications such as Ladies' Home Journal, Downey's Magazine, and Yankee Magazine. His photographs have also been published in multiple educational materials through Pearson Education. So again, welcome to the lecture, and we're going to be having questions at the end of the lecture. However, if something comes up while he's speaking, please feel free to use the chat box to enter in your questions and ask away. So Nathan, with that being said, I'm going to pass the platform over to you.
Like Mel said, feel free to fire away. I wanted to start with this because I did this at the very beginning of my career when I kind of went out on my own. This is a very personal portrait, and at the time I wanted to shoot 4x5 portraits in an intimate style, and I designed my own way of doing this by taking apart 4x5 lenses and creating this background that brings the subject into this kind of ephemeral world. And I was doing this in multiple different, always on location, but with multiple different subjects. And this is actually a portrait of me. With my first passion is writing, and I think photography and writing are kind of a hand-in-hand dance. You're telling a story. It's either through a visual medium or words. And it was either Raymond Carver or Charles Bukowski who said writing is indifference to everything except the piece of paper and the typewriter. So this was my illustration of that particular quote. And this is really pushing the boundaries of portraiture, photography, and luck. Again, my subject is myself. And it was freezing cold on January 1st of 2000. And I needed to document this kind of catharsis that was happening and that I was going through. And I luckily got this beautiful kind of moray down at the bottom due to the cold and the chemistry. So as I was using this technique and using these cameras, I started to, I was new to Portland and new to Maine and new to my own career. I needed to get out into the public and kind of announce my presence as to what I was doing. So I started showing up at bookstores, galleries, music stores, and putting a little kind of photo set together where it was myself, the backdrop, the camera, and one light. And people would show up. And at first it would be, 10 or 20 people would show up. After a while, I started to get 50 to 60 to 70 people showing up to sit for a portrait where this was using Polaroid Type 55, which had a positive and a negative. I kept the negative and they kept the positive. And this was my assistant who stood for me as we began the process this one night. And again, and this image has carried itself through many awards and lots of recognition. And I'm still kind of, when people see this picture around in Maine and New England, it's recognized as mine. It's one of my signature styles. And this is from that same type of thing. I didn't realize what was happening, but when I made this portrait of Sam James, and he's a blues musician in Portland, Maine, he and I were making some pictures in this public event, and I didn't realize about 45 people were standing behind me, listening to Sam James play and watching me photograph him. And as as I stopped after making this photograph, I kind of was about to direct Sam and ask him to do something else. I mean, at this point, I'm really making an image as soon as he looks up at me, and I get him to do something. I heard all this clapping, and I turned around and I saw this crowd of people, and it was probably one of the most lucrative nights I had on this project, where and now everyone wanted a picture, and some of them wanted a picture with Sam. But one of the funny things that happened with this is that he used it as his album cover for his first studio release album, and as he was touring around the nation promoting this album, he would show up and everyone expected him to play Robert Johnson based blues because he is dressing this part of the old Delta bluesman, and he had to stop wearing suits. He stopped using this photograph. It's not on his site anymore. We're still great friends, but he has a whole new look and doesn't dress this swanky looking dapper dude style anymore. It's kind of how sometimes you are pigeonholed either by what you are photographing or how you have been photographed. This is from that same series that became the book that Mel mentioned at the beginning. This is, a friend who came in as I was making portraits and it was raining, and I love the rain on her glasses. So I sat her down, and I think this image is so provocative in so many different ways. And at this point, I was starting to get asked to do editorial assignments. And this was a winemaker in Maine, one of the first people to decide to make that Maine could grow and make wine. And the beauty about working for a magazine and editorial assignment is, they kind of give you the subject and let you go. There isn't an art director over your shoulder, and it's a really effective way of meeting people and getting to know what they do. It's really a nice experience. I like this kind of editorial work. And Brian was a winemaker, and one of the promotions that he had done is a little promotion called Meet Your Maker, and this is the hat and his outfit that he always wears. This is the barn that he's in, and I loved the way they had set this up. He had this outfit, and I thought all of this came together graphically, and with these little orange balls up in the top, they almost kind of look like grapes if grapes were orange, but it worked. It was very effective. This is a stretch on a portrait, where normally a portrait is considered a portrait because someone is looking at the camera. But I needed to illustrate the story. This woman had lost a daughter and worked tirelessly to get this. She lost a daughter in a public pool due to drainage systems and the suction and the circulation pump in a pool didn't have a guard on it. So this woman had to, while she was grieving for the loss of her daughter, also made it all the way to the White House to get these grates put on public pool vents. And as I was talking to her and getting her to know her, it was obvious that there was all this resistance, and she had to go through Congress and she had to get this law, but there was also she became in the end this beacon of hope. So when I showed up to photograph her, it was really windy, but there was this lighthouse in the back, which to use a lighthouse in an image is although cliche, it is a beacon, and it can be either a warning sign or a beacon of hope. So as the sun was rising in the background and this lighthouse is there, it just seemed perfect to me to make this portrait of this woman who had been struggling and had actually achieved something through kind of a dire situation. And are there any questions at this point, Mel? Everyone happy?
We did actually have a question about the lens that you use for your editorial work. Would you say that you're shooting more of a wider angle, or does it depend on the situation?
It depends on the situation, but I like to use wide angle lenses. Yeah, I like to. This particular image is 24 millimeter, and I do 99. Well, I don't know, 98% of my work with the 24-70. I shoot, at this point, I shoot almost all exclusively Canon. I don't do a lot of 4x5 anymore. I shoot the Canon 5D and the 24-70. L series lens is my go-to. I have it everywhere. And this is wide open. I'm probably about 8 feet away from her so that I can get all this information, but still have her present and own the frame. So I do everything. Yeah, I think from my view, I like to be as wide as possible. It's a different take on a portrait, but
Right.
I like the information. This as well. This is a wide angle, but I'm literally probably about 24 inches from him. And this is Vince Clarke, who's one of the founding members of Depeche Mode, and Erasure. And I was walking through his studio, and he was going through and talking about all his studio is this log cabin up here in Damariscotta, and he has all these synthesizers everywhere in his rows and rows of synthesizers that he continues to work with and work on. And he was going through and explaining on all these different. I mean, he's worked with Annie Lennox, with Eurythmics, and he's huge in the synthesizer kind of pop tech music, and also very intense. So and he's got this perfectly round bald head, and it's all these round knobs, and this is a photographic delight for me. So I sat him in front of this, and I also used a ring flash that is, if you don't know what a ring flash is, it's a flash that goes around the lens, so you don't really have any shadow except on the shoulder, directly outlining the subject. And it highlights the roundness of all the knobs, it highlights the roundness of his head, and it just kind of brings this, creates a symmetry with all of these kind of round elements. This is done for a local magazine, and it was a feature on this one musician here who had successfully put this big band together. And I didn't want to just do, a typical school portrait where everyone's just kind of standing around. And he had this lovely staircase, this spiral staircase in his house. So it just lent itself to, all right, I'm going to put the women, I'm going to stand some of the women up on top and have the men surround on the bottom. And, I'm going to fit them together. And I try to keep, photography is about light sensitive material. And I like to keep my technicality as subtle as possible without, but I also want to make an image as interesting as I can. So, for those that are interested in how I've lit it, I'm off to the right here where the main subject is the guy in the front, obviously. And I have a softbox off to the left, and there's a reflector card I'm sorry, the softbox is off to camera right, and there's a reflector card on the left, and then up and back that highlights the women on the stairs and kind of gives them that spark. I have a raw light head, strobe head up there, so that's how I make that, her hair light up and the interior of her arm kind of separate. Otherwise, their head just kind of goes black into the darkness up there. And then to combine that, these little IKEA lights, they're not giving anything off, so I drag the shutter. So I think this exposure was probably about a second or two, but the only lights that are in there are those two, the two lights that are up above. Everything else is all strobe. And this is getting back to, it's another magazine assignment, and but it's a portrait of a writer, and I've always been fascinated with pictures of writers, and one, because I always wanted to be a published writer. I think that'd be really sexy. And two, whenever I read a book, if I'm getting into a book, I keep flipping back between the author portrait and how this person came up with it. Like, does their face tell me anything about how they came up with these ideas? Is there something in the way that they look that tells me about this narrative, this story that I'm being brought into? And this woman is Heidi Julavitz, and she is a very well-known writer, and there's a kind of a writer's circle up in this little place in Maine where she is part of it with Richard Ford and Jonathan Lethem and Michael Chabon, they all have these different houses in this little community, and they have summer up there, and it's this kind of writer mecca right now. And I keep begging her to invite me to this barbecue where I can make portraits of everybody there, but I've yet to receive that invitation.
One day it'll come.
Yeah, one can only hope. And again, writers and musicians and I photograph whoever is standing in front of me, and this is one of the big music stars in Maine, who's Dave Gutter. He's the frontman of Rustic Overtones, and I was doing this. This was for an advertisement for the luthier who made this guitar, and we were working with Dave in a bunch of different styles, like in the studio, outside of the studio. He had this cool old car and this young little pit bull, and then kind of towards the end of the day, the sun was setting and Dave was kind of walking around with the guitar strapped on him. So I had him stand in front of me and shade me from the sun. So and in back of me is a white building. So I used this white building to fill the light on him as the sun in the background kind of came in. You can see, the shadow of his legs. I'm literally I'm wide, 24 millimeters, and I'm probably wide open too, and without him there, it'd just be a blur. But it's the idea of you use what you have and use what you see, and always continue to look for something different. And this is the image that ran for the ad for the luthier, and at this point he can't keep up with business. So I like to think that I had something to do with that.
Nathan, real quick, are those vignettes on that last image, are those like a lens vignette or a vignette that you added in Photoshop?
It was I did it in camera, and what I did was take my lens hood and I wrapped gaffer tape around it, because I could see that without the vignette, I think what actually happened is that as I was photographing this, I bumped my lens hood and it shaded my lens, but I thought it was cool. So my assistant and I wrapped the lens hood with all this gaffer tape to create even more of this optical illusion. And then in Lightroom and Photoshop, I enhanced it and make it look even more dramatic.
Yeah.
And it was kind of something that could have been a mistake happened, and I thought it looked cool, and it ended up being, I think, being pretty effective. Yeah. I mean, we're literally outside. There's really nothing interesting about this environment with the truck and the minivan in the background, but like I don't even see that. I see him in this. There's this. It's about Dave, and he is this true to the bone musician where he's going to do whatever it takes to make and write songs, and it doesn't matter where he is.
Nice, thank you.
Yeah, which is the exact opposite of this picture. I'm pretty sure this was for a magazine, and this is obviously the mayor of Portland, but he had won this election in Portland against 12 other people. It was a huge field, and Portland has this back cove, and I figured, how do I show? I mean, how do I make a picture of the mayor? What is that going to look like? So I wanted to incorporate Portland in the back, and Portland is on the water. It's a peninsula, so I needed some water in there, and this was one of the locations I run by this most days, most mornings, and this was the location, and it was I asked this office, can the mayor be there at like 6:30 in the morning before he begins his day? And he was really excited about it, and he bought the portrait from me, and it hangs in the mayor's office.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I think that's pretty cool. I'm sorry. And this is, I'm putting this in here to show you as an example of, you never really know where your career is going to take you. And you kind of have to stand up for yourself when there really isn't any reason to. And I made this portrait of my friend who is a poet and a writer, and I pitched it to a magazine, and the magazine, and it was a magazine that I was working with, and they didn't take it. They didn't like it, but they kept the picture. And a year later, hired an illustrator to illustrate this picture and run it in the magazine without any credit to me. So I got pissed, so I sued him, and it obviously totally destroyed my relationship with the magazine. And I hired this woman to represent me, and her law firm then hired me to make portraits of the entire firm, and I made, probably 700 times the amount of money working for the law firm as I would have through the magazine. And it just, it was not fun. I didn't want to go through a lawsuit, but I had to stand up for myself, and I had to stand up for what I believed in. And I don't, as as creative agents and content creators, people will take our intellectual property right, and you kind of have to know when to really stand up and so you have to protect yourself, and it's not a bad idea to be friends with a lawyer too, because you never know, the law firm might hire you. And I now have this very strong relationship with this partner at this law firm, and he just bought this portrait and another portrait that I made of him to keep for his heirs. It's very interesting the way the story went, but I was happy that it happened. This is a portrait of a friend of mine who came up with he worked in clothing for a long time, and he started doing these t-shirts, these graphic t-shirts in Maine, he started this company called Rogues Gallery. And this is him and his dog on his property. And I love his property. It was, you really can't find a better place. And I see him as kind of a visionary, but also kind of very approachable. And this was one day where I showed up. He wanted me to make some pictures of his house because I think it was Vogue was doing a story on him. And I was doing a lot of work for him with his t-shirts. And it's kind of, Alex, I need to make a picture of you and your dog. I'll come and take pictures of your house, but you got to just stand outside and entertain me. So I think this is personally one of my favorite portraits. This is a picture of his t-shirt, and this portrait has probably brought me more work than any other picture I have, just with its simplicity and its kind of, real Maine authenticity, which to me, I didn't realize it was so in vogue at the time I was making it. I thought he looked cool, and I loved the skull. It was it's for this t-shirt company. It is like he's holding his hands in fists because it is probably 2 degrees outside. And we let him wear this checkered wool shirt in this picture, but most of the day he was in a t-shirt. You got to be true to your art, I guess, and every now and then you have to freeze a model. I try not to do it that often. I feel it's really important to keep pushing your own personal work. And I know I talked about wide angle lenses before, and I still 98% of assignment work I do with a wide angle lens, 24 millimeter. But I fell in love with Canon's 85 1.2. It has absolutely gorgeous fall off. And this was a friend of mine who had this very intense mustache, and I called him up and I got to photograph your mustache. You just got to come over and sit for me. So he came over and sat for me, and that the fall off of that lens and his mustache and his hair going haywire. This is another personal favorite of mine. The fact that his collar isn't straight, it's out on the left and tucked on the right. I mean, for a fashion consultant, that would be horrific. But for me, for a portrait, I think there's an intimacy and an approachability. And I mean, it's really just a guy with a mustache and crazy hair. But I think this image, you kind of want to look at him, and you want to know his story and what's Lars thinking in this picture. And I think that's how a portrait works for me. In the same way, but opposite, that this does. And this is as I was experimenting with the 85 and kind of pushing its boundaries. There's for those that are interested in the technical side of things, this is entirely backlit. There's no front light on her at all. the only thing I have in back of me is a piece of white foam core. So if the original file is really thin, so when I boosted the density to this, everything came through, and all the background just disappeared to white. And this is from a current client that I'm working with that is a bank, um, and this is again an example of you really never know where your career trajectory is going to take you. Where I started out making pictures of me jumping in the field with a 4x5 camera, I'm now working with investment lenders and bankers, and still doing portraits. And you know, if you're ever given the challenge to make a portrait interesting, there's really nothing more challenging than bankers and lawyers. But you know, it's still a portrait, it's still a face, and it's still someone with history. And I think if you can get the individual's history to read on their face in a picture, then you have made a successful portrait. This is again a similar story where if you can bring that out of someone, I think the expression on her face is beyond words. And this is a project. There's going to be more images from this project coming up, but this is an outtake from a project that I did in Maine a few years ago. I can't remember, 4 or 5 years ago. We had a bill on the ballot to allow same-sex marriages, and I put together. A friend of mine and I were talking about it and comparing same-sex marriage to interracial marriage, where we didn't, you know, what's the problem between these? You know, there was a time when people of mixed race couldn't marry. Now there's a time when there's opposition to same-sex couples getting married. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's a Dominican man married to a white woman. He's, you know, we have to do something about this. So and my suggestion was, why don't we just put everybody in a white sweep and we'll just stand in there holding hands. This was my friend who I did the project with, who happens to be a DJ, and I had photographed him in his environment. I think this is an incredible portrait. Even though it's not following portrait rules, where he's not looking at the lens, and you know, he's really not connecting with us. But he's, to me, he's still letting us come in, because there's this moment happening, and we are witness to this moment. He's, you know, drifting off with some tunes. Oh, I'm sorry, I guess I'm a little off, but I'll come back to the what's the problem pictures later. And this is a project that I just did 2 years ago. It was commissioned to photograph farmers at market as they were setting up by an auto dealer here in southern Maine. And the commission was for me to show up and photograph these 3 or 4 different farmers markets. And 24 of the pictures were printed large scale and hang in the auto dealership. And I also produced a book for it. And you know, this is at maybe 5 in the morning, showing up with the idea being he wanted to see all these cars, how these farmers pack their cars so full before they begin their day. The whole store is wrapped in there, and it's just these 4 people, and they're there. You know, they work all day on the farm, and then they pack it all in the truck, and then bring it to the market. And it has received numerous. It's seen a lot. It was a really fun kind of project, and I had no idea it was going to come up. And this is where I'm getting back to what's the problem. And you know, I was just this simple white sweep, one light. All I'm interested in is the relationship between these 2 people. And they're happy, they're holding hands. This project was so much fun, and actually gained a huge amount of awareness. And I don't think I had a lot to do with it, but Maine did pass one of the first referendums to allow same-sex marriage, interracial marriage. You know, there's a simple way for me to be involved and talk about a complicated political issue. And then returning back to kind of where I started recently, I have been focusing on, you know, what are the images that I want to make for myself, and create my own personal work. And my favorite go-to camera right now, and I know some people will probably be appalled to hear this, but I love working with my iPhone. And the next few images that you see here have all been created with my iPhone. and I have a Tumblr blog that I do put a bunch of these up called This Is Maine, and it just it's one look, and I always have it with me, and my feeling is what my favorite camera is the camera that I have with me, and it's usually my iPhone, and I'm able to get into these moments. This is my son as we're taking him up to go sledding, and this picture I want to come back to because this was a moment in the New York Public Library that I was just kind of walking around looking at things, and this guy was over reading a book, and the arch to his back and his head matches the arch in the back of the building, and all these like MC Escher lines are coming in, and to me it was this moment, and I remember I saw it, and I was so inspired by this moment. My hands were shaking, and I had to figure out how to hold the camera still so I could get a shot off. And I think it's one of my most successful images. I have this printed very large scale in my house, which you still can do with an iPhone grab. Again, my son, and this is my daughter, and personal work is now a lot about. It's really what fuels my heart, and where I kind of find my own song. This is my partner. This was actually taken almost, I think, a year ago today in Culebra, and then I think it's important to really focus on what you do, why you do it, and who you do it for. And I do it for this little one and this little one, and that is the end of my slideshow.
Excellent. Thank you, Nathan. What a beautiful presentation. We've gotten some really positive feedback on the side here. And just to answer an immediate question, I copied and pasted your Tumblr blog into the chat section so the students could check those out. There's a lot of questions pertaining you using your iPhone. When would you say that you use your iPhone in relation to when you want to use your DSLR camera?
I use my DSLR camera when I am on assignment, or if I'm really creating an image. If I'm taking some time to, my iPhone's always with me. It's in my pocket. It's wherever I go. And I do have an Cig Orbit that allows me to put a little. It has 3 lenses on it. I never use the fisheye or the macro, but it does have a 2x teleconverter, so it allows me to get a little bit closer to the subject. But I don't use it for assignments. I use it for only personal work. But that said, I'm using my Canon DSLR for personal work less and less. It's really about what I want to, and I think there will be some change to camera technology. I think the SLRs you'll start to see that they'll have sharing ability. And I think that's important. I think you need, especially now with the connectivity the way it is, imagery is really about being shared and seen, as opposed to being the force behind a campaign. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think imagery will always be valued for a campaign, and you can put a lot of information into an image. But for personal work, I'm doing a lot of it, and I set it up. I started doing it about a year ago, where I wanted to push myself, and just I'm only using one look, one app, one camera, one lens, and I'm going to do a whole body of work this way. And that was started just over a year ago, and it was that's what I started. This Is Maine, which is a lot of pictures like this, and like this. There's visions around how I see my life, and how my life unfolds, and what I see is interesting. And I like this antiquated look. I mean, it is, it's a digital version of wet plate, but I love wet plate. And if it was more convenient, I could carry it around in my pocket, I'd do it. But this pleases me just as much.
Yeah. Lot of I've seen this question a couple of times. Which apps are you using to edit these iPhone pictures?
This is a Hipstamatic.
Okay.
with a wet plate. I can't remember what it is. But you too can make images like this. And I think the reason, well, the thought behind it, and the reason why I limited it to one app, there's a big push on Instagram to do the no filter thing, and I think that's great. And I think it's important to find your voice and find your. It's almost like finding your paragraph. How do what is the statement you want to make, and create some parameters and structure around it so that you can force yourself to be creative in one particular direction. And what I wanted to focus on, I didn't want to worry about how I was going to light something or what what color, what grain, or I wanted to focus on composition. And all of these images were just me focusing on where I'm placing my subject and what I'm going to get in the frame and how it's going to look as a composition, nothing else. And I have several of this particular series. She's walking away from me, but it's this image where she's standing right on that the pinnacle of that where the beach isn't wet, and then where the beach is wet towards me is her reflection. And these clouds are magic in the background. It's a square. All of those elements. I wanted to weed out. I wanted to think about composition and enforce just the composition. So I created my parameters as to I only use, it's one app, it's one camera, and it's one like level or filter on the app that I use. And that whole, if you go to This Is Maine, and or if you go to my website, there's a place called Creative where I have NathanEldridge.com on Creative. There's a whole series of these that show a lot more.
Nice. Would you say that you prefer working in color or black and white, or does it depend?
I think it depends. It depends for me entirely. Sometimes I don't think this image would look as good in black and white. It's really about what I'm feeling, and when it's me expressing the vision of a client, I really have to take that out of it. And a lot of times now, advertising, not so much. Advertising, you can still get away with using black and white, but everyone wants color. This image, I think, is designed to be black and white, but I mean, it is a digital capture, so it was captured in color. I didn't like the color, so I took it out, and I wanted it to be monochromatic, where what you are experiencing what he's thinking. And it was one client looked at it and said this is he liked to think of it as a Zen portrait. Well, if there's any way, I don't think I could ever capture Zen in a portrait, but if this is what it reads to someone, that's fine by me.
Yeah. Would you say that you crop a lot, or are you trying to get your shots in terms of composition like right there in the camera?
I personally think cropping is for farmers. I do like to farm, and that's when I like to apply the crop. But I try not to. I shoot full frame. I see full frame, which is why I want to do. Which is why I shoot with a 24mm lens. And if 24 isn't working, I usually get pretty close to the subject, and the camera is kind of a tool that I use to talk to people. And so I do very little cropping, and I do very little post-processing. Most of the posting that I do is just to enhance and bring out some density. I don't want to spend a lot of time at a computer. I'd rather be out with the camera working with a subject or telling a story.
Yeah, I could see that. Definitely see that. Couple questions regarding background and blurring. You had mentioned that when you were using a particular type of lens, the focusing just kind of fell off. With some of your other images where you might be using a shallow depth of field, are you creating that through the aperture or through use of zoom?
It's usually created through aperture. With the Canon 85 1.2, I'm sure Nikon has a version of it too. I mean, there is literally like maybe a centimeter of depth of field. There's nothing. I mean, the tip of this guy's nose is soft. His whiskers on his mustache, the front of him are soft, but as it gets back into his mustache, you can see it, but his eyelashes are sharp, and that's what I look for in a portrait. I want to see eyelashes are sharp. Otherwise, for me, it feels like the whole picture is soft. So if you can see their eyelashes, and especially with an intimate portrait like this one, where it's really just kind of graphical information. If his eyelashes are sharp, he's in focus. You're looking at his eyes, and focus will direct. It's a tool, and it directs you to what you want to look at. And that's kind of how I engage my viewer in within a portrait, is how where the focus is going to be, what the focus is going to be on. And if someone's looking at my camera, I'm going to try and put it on their eyes.
Right.
And I do it with depth of field and aperture, through aperture, depth of field through aperture.
Okay, cool. When you're editing your images, a lot of students are curious if you are using Lightroom, if you're using Photoshop.
I edit everything through Lightroom. I do almost 98% of my work through Lightroom. I love Lightroom. I live in it. I think it's an incredibly effective tool. It brings me back to being at a light table,
Mm-hmm.
using slides where you have the negative, scroll at the bottom, however you want to set it up. But I keep it at the bottom with the big image on top, and go through, and I've got it down to, I have my own editing system I can get through, and I tend to shoot a lot. I like to push the button. So if I go out and make, if I'm on an assignment for a magazine, they wanna edit through. It's a story on someone. Let me see if I can flip through and find something quickly. Something like this. I probably shot 300 images of the mayor out there this day, and there's not a lot of changes in the images, but I keep pushing the button because I want the expression. I want some expression that's going to connect me to this individual as an individual. It's not about my strobe or the tools that I'm using are only to highlight the expression that I'm after. So I tend to shoot more than I should, because it can make editing kind of a pain in the ass. But Lightroom
Mm-hmm.
has made that easier. So I use it, and then Lightroom talks directly to Photoshop. Again, I do very little in Photoshop. If I need to, I will go through and do some Photoshop work. Actually, this particular image, I edited out the image that I gave to him. I took out that seaweed that's around his legs.
Oh, okay.
But
Yeah.
that's the kind of Photoshop work I would do. Embarrassingly enough, I'm not very. I mean, I'm skilled enough in Photoshop, but if it's something too complicated, I'll hire someone to do posting in
Mm-hmm.
it. But I don't want to. I don't do that a lot.
Right. And in terms of Photoshop, do you ever use any filters on your editing process?
No,
No.
no,
Next.
no. I might use the
No.
aperture tool,
Mm-hmm.
where they have some apertures in there now, but no. I tend to, if I get into Photoshop, it's really to kind of maybe clean something up, or separate the subject from the background. Is something that I might do, but most of the stuff goes to the client right out of Lightroom, or printed right out of Lightroom.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. And when you're setting up, let's say for this particular picture here, the mayor, are you using a gray card or a light meter, or how do you decide what type of strobe lights you actually want to use?
Well, honestly, I had that thought out beforehand. Um, we started in the morning, so I knew the light was going to be low and in back of the city,
Mm-hmm.
and in back of the mayor. So his face was going to be dark. So I knew that I wanted a strobe light with, a 10 to 20% grid, because all I wanted to light was his face and maybe his hands. And so, yeah, about 8 feet away from this subject is a light and it's concentrated looking at the mayor. And I'll do a test grab with a I made a Macbeth card on him, with my assistant standing next to him holding it, and then um, I, I'm usually within a few stops difference. I rarely bracket. I find something that I like just by, like, as soon as I get it, I just go from there. Um, and then I might do a little burning of his hands to bring it out a little bit more. Um,
Yeah.
but it's usually I try to I think of that, I think about the image pretty quickly before as soon as it's conceptualized. I'll try and scout a situation. I might take my assistant with me to scout and a location. All right, this is where the sun's going to be. This is the light. This is how I want to light it. This is how I want it to look. And then once we get there, I start working and might make some variations and changes, but it usually is pretty close to where I started.
Nice, nice. And are you using a tripod for a lot of these, or just for your slower shutter speed images?
Only for the slower shutter speed images. I can't a tripod. I end up walking around with a camera hung like the tripod hanging off the camera. It really and then I end up tripping on it. I move so much. A tripod just slows me down too much. It really drives me crazy. But if I'm dragging the shutter, which I did with in this one, I had to. I can't hold it a second. It'd be a blur. So I have to be
Mm-hmm.
set it up. And this image also lent itself to being on a tripod because there's, I don't know, almost 15, 1, 2, 4, 6, 7, a lot of people
Right.
for a portrait. So, I mean, I kind of have to, I have to find my frame, put them in the frame, and then make the picture around that, as opposed to, um, you know, this is not on a tripod. This
Mm-hmm.
certainly is not. I'm moving around so quickly. A tripod would just get in my way.
Right, right. Um, just because I know you a little bit and know some of these people in the images, there's a really great question in the chat box regarding the business aspect of your freelance business and when you're working with friends. How do you, because I'm assuming a lot of our students are reaching out to either friends or family members to take their pictures. And then when you kind of cross that border into charging people, how do you deal with that delicate balance?
That's a great question, and it never gets easy.
Mm-hmm.
I think you is when it gets to the point, if I'm making a picture for myself, then I'm asking someone to do something for me. So either I'm going to give them something in return, whether and oftentimes, I mean, I I, I swear by the 6 pack rule. If someone's going to sit for me, I make sure that there's a 6 pack of beer, so that they or wine or whatever, so they at least feel taken care of in some way or another.
Mm-hmm.
And then I give them the image. When people ask me to do stuff for them, I feel that if I, when I am asked, can you make a picture of me and my kids, or can I need a portrait for LinkedIn? And that's a question that's coming up quite a bit. I need a portrait for LinkedIn, which is essentially a headshot, and it's a business professional headshot. So there's technique, there's ability. They're asking me to do what I do, which is the same thing as asking your plumber, I need you to like fix the pipes. There needs to be some exchange for that. And I begin the conversation, well, normally for a headshot, I might charge $600, $400, whatever you feel comfortable charging. I do often make light of it and say there's a friends and family discount, and where do you think you're going to be comfortable? And I think everything is negotiable. I think it comes down to how much you want to do the picture.
Mm-hmm.
Is it going to be something? Is this particular image going to be portfolio material? Will you be able to use it to advertise your own work, or is it more of a favor for a friend? And you can never have too many favors owed. And I think that's really valuable. I trade all the time, where I'll make portraits of kids for people, and I really enjoy it because kids don't care; they just want to be kids. So you just run around making pictures. Um, and
Yeah.
then, sorry,
Oh, that's okay.
sorry about that. I didn't know why that happened. Um, but does that answer the question?
Yeah, definitely. And just speaking of kids, we have a lot of students who are parents. I've got one question from Ariel. She's saying she's a mother studying a career in photography. She's curious to know how old your kids are and what made you decide to go into photography, or if you're already into photography before you started a family.
I was already a photographer before I started a family. My kids are now 10 and 7, and it it was not easy. I was probably 4 or 5 years into my career when I had my children, and it at the time I was traveling a lot and working for I didn't show any of the images because they're not necessarily portraits, but for a rescue company that I was specializing in recreating accident scenes. So I was gone a lot, and that was trying and complicated. But I think if you're this is my daughter now, and I make photographs of them. I incorporate my
Mm-hmm.
life into my professional work, and I think if you wanna, I don't know what subject you want to make your vocation in a career in photography, but if you can incorporate it, there's there's no reason why not to photograph your own children and just develop a body of work. And I mean that's one of the everybody wants pictures of their kids, and if that's a way to create a body of work, if you want to photograph kids and want to photograph children, having your own children, you're halfway there.
Right.
You just fire away.
Yeah. Did you ever consider not photographing people, or has it always been, portraits that was what you were interested in?
Portraits were it's always been about working with people for me.
Hmm.
But that's not to say that I haven't done some still life stuff, and that's kind of exciting. It's a different way of thinking. It's much more photographic. It's much more technique based. Where does the light on the can appear? How do I get rid of that highlight? Specular highlight is on the left. I need it to be on the right. Um, all of those things are much different than when you're photographing a face. And for me, it's more about the storytelling aspect. And I think every portrait has a story. Everybody wears a story on their face. And that was what drew me to photography. Um, and that's what keeps me involved and keeps kind of keeps me inspired. There's so every face is infinite and
Hmm.
can tell so many different stories, and to be able to stop time and and catch some kind of interaction that I've had with someone, um, for me that's kind of what it is all about.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a comment in here that all about, um, Paula was saying it's all about capturing the story, I guess,
To
when
me,
put,
yeah.
yeah. Hmm. Just to get back to you mentioned the lawsuit, towards the middle. Lots of questions about that. Um,
Yeah, my best advice would be to avoid that at all possibilities. But if you need to, call me up and I'll do what I can. Um, but whatever the question is, feel free to fire away.
did you win?
Well, what I learned is that there is really no winning. There's just who runs out of money first. So
Mm,
I wasn't after a lot. It was more about making a statement and and feeling like I protected myself or stood up for myself. So in that sense, I felt like I did. There was no settlement. There was, I hired this woman to
mhm,
write to the magazine and say you can't do this, and I did make an ask. I said I'd like you to like acknowledge this, give me credit, and pay me a couple $100. And I got a letter from their attorney, and then very quickly figured out that it was just going to be a bunch of attorneys writing letters back and forth, and I was going to end up paying for it. So that's about as far as I went. But I ended up making so much more money working for the law firm than working for the magazine.
right.
I will say that it was in hindsight, it was I wish I'd have handled it differently. I don't regret that I went down that road, but it is Portland is a very small town, and I made a powerful enemy.
Yeah, yeah.
But I also have this law firm that continues to hire me now. So maybe I made some powerful friends too.
Yeah, I think
Uh,
so.
I, I,
Definitely.
I mean, I'd rather not have a powerful enemy, especially someone in the publishing business. But I mean, that was the choice I made, and I continued to walk in that direction. So I think I wanted to run my business with integrity, and I wanted to stand up for what I felt was right. And I didn't think that what they did was, I didn't think that was okay, and I needed to let them know that.
Yeah, and I don't know, it kind of brings me back to that question a couple moments ago about dealing with friends and family. I mean, you were kind of working with this magazine for a while, and I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
sticking up for yourself is certainly important.
yeah.
On that same thread, there's a student in here saying that they don't necessarily want to just be a freelance photographer at first. They want to try to look for a company or a publication to work for to get a little bit more experience under their belt before they jump into the freelance world. What kind of advice can you give somebody who's interested in that?
I did not study photography in college, and I think the best way to learn, especially if you have a background through the institution and some classwork behind it, you're so far ahead of the game. If you get out and start assisting others or go work at a company, I think there's no there's no better way to learn than learning from others that have already gone before you. And in the worst case scenario, all you're going to learn is what not to do,
Yeah,
and it's still time well spent. And you will learn what you don't like and what you do like. And it was my particular choice was to work for other photographers. And then I started here in Maine, where it's not like there's a plethora of photographers in Maine. And it was very quick. I learned very quickly that I didn't want to work with product. I didn't want to be in a hot studio shooting tents or knives or hello bean boots. I wanted to be outside. I wanted to photograph people because the stories were what intrigued me.
hmm,
So I started working with editorial photographers, and then I moved to New York City to work for photographers in New York City, and then that kind of opened up fashion and working in with models and just a totally different environment where I went from photographing lobstermen to photographing women in bras in New York City, and I don't know how it, it was such a juxtaposition, but it was so valuable to see. Photography is huge. You can really make it anything you want to make it. Um, but I don't think you should ever. The only advice I would give is don't stop learning, and never. As soon as you think you know it all, you should give it up because there's so much
right,
to learn, and there's going to be other people coming up behind you. Um, and and I think once you get to a point where you are comfortable making your images and you have your voice, that's when you step out on your own and you start doing it for yourself, and then hopefully you give back. Whether it's an artist lecture or bring other people to work for you. I think the assistant route is really powerful. And there is a community, and it can be helpful. I think it is a value to stay in kind of a more urban setting. It's very competitive, and the further removed you get from where things are happening, the harder it is. Um,
hmm,
but that's not to say, I mean, that's not to say it can't happen from anywhere. It's
right,
really, and you have to decide what your measure of success is, and where you want your career to go.
right, right. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for this evening's lecture. If it's okay with you, would you mind if students directed questions your way after the
Absolutely.
lecture? Okay, great.
Anytime. Yeah.
What
And
would,
you can read through my website.
okay. So if you guys hadn't checked out the website already, I've pasted it into the chat box. It's also available to you guys on the first year's Focus and Fire blog. There was an update on Nathan's lecture put up there today. And Nathan, again, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to give this lecture to our students. There's a lot of positive feedback, lots of thank yous. Well,
Thank you.
thank yous are
I had a ball.
they're rolling in. It's like, thank you very much, thank you. So everybody enjoyed your lecture. Thank you so much. And
I had a ball. Thank you.
oh, you're so welcome. And everybody have a good evening. And this is a recorded lecture. We'll have it posted on the PSPN community shortly.
Good night, y'all.
Great. Good night. Thanks.